Sean is a Deloitte US global greenhouse leader, has over 19 years of experience advising on cross-functional leadership practices, policies, and procedures from development to implementation. He's designed and delivered over 50 facilitated sessions in addition to leading large-scale bilateral climate summits in over 16 countries, and his focus has been on everything from transitioning C-suite executives into new role to assisting clients and account teams in identifying proactive and innovative strategies for growth. So he's coming from the corporate sector to share a little bit of the learning that they have there with us here in the documentary and public media space, which I think is also kind of an intersectionality that we have to consider. So I want to welcome Sean to the podium and to give his talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer, and you didn't have to convince me to come here. It's really my pleasure to be here today. I want to start with a picture of this little girl. She's 16 months old, and her birth father is Jamaican. Her birth mother is half Puerto Rican and half white. She is adopted by two gay, white, upper middle-class males, and this was all figured out and legally bound before she was born. So before she was born, she already had a multiplicity of identities. And her story is key to the story of intersectionality. And her name is Tierney, and she's my daughter. But before we talk about intersectionality, I want to talk a little bit about where I came from. So you heard something from Jennifer already about my unusual French/corporate background. This is where I had the pleasure of growing up. It's a small town in Pennsylvania that was recently ranked the most distressed place in all of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is a big state. It was voted most distressed by a Washington, D.C. think tank that based it on several different factors, so economic, housing, work, income. My mother had grown up there with my grandparents who owned a small insurance business, and my mother moved away, was one of the few from the town that was educated. She met my dad, who was a Shakespearean actor. So I have a long connection to film and to acting, so that's another reason why I'm happy to be here today. He was obviously a weird fit for this town. They moved back to take over the family business, and the one thing that he said to my grandparents was, "We'll move back here and take over the business as long as my kids can go to a good school," because there were no good schools around there. So I traveled an hour and a half by bus every single day to go to this very fancy, expensive private school. So you can see I had two identities from a very early age. I had friends in both of these places, one that was economically distressed, one that was the opposite of that. I was honestly an outcast in both. And it only got worse from there. When I was about 12, and we know this today, but little boys who like Madonna tend to possibly be gay, and in fact I was. So I was the 3 times now an outcast. I didn't really fit into the town I grew up in, didn't fit into the school I went to, and on top of that I was gay. My one goal in life was to leave and to move to New York City. So I think I was the only person in the history of my high school to graduate a year early, to just get out of there. I spent about 6 months studying music in Austria, and then I went to Sarah Lawrence College in New York, which has a great film program, by the way. Again, another elite school, one of the most expensive, at least at that time, in the country. So I was inhabiting all of these different worlds in different socioeconomic spheres. I rode crew in college. Not a very common thing to do at Sarah Lawrence, so once again, I was sort of living on the fringes, but in a different way. I studied a year in Paris, which led to ultimately me deciding to get my Ph.D. in French literature, with a focus on sexuality in pre-revolutionary France. Because I didn't come from a very wealthy place, I had to work my way through school. So I spent 8 years working in a law firm as a legal assistant, doing essentially grunt work for very demanding partners. And that ultimately led me to forensic technology at Deloitte, which is where I started my career at Deloitte. I did that for several years before moving into affirmative action work, and I managed our as a federal contractor, Deloitte has to abide by a lot of rules and do reporting on affirmative action. it was that job that really was critical for me in starting to marry the two different passions of mine, so academia and research with the corporate sphere. Before then, I had really struggled to figure out how to make those two come together. So that's me. If you look on LinkedIn, you'll see this picture, and chances are, if you don't know me and didn't hear that description about me, you'd probably just think there's another privileged white guy who seems like he's had a lot of luck in life. My identity is much more complex than that, certainly much richer to me. I am not a box to check. You'll see all of the items that we talked about that are parts of my identity, but then layer onto that I try to read a book a week. I'm a parent, I'm a vegetarian, I am bilingual, I try to work out at least 5 times a week. I am balding, as Jennifer said, have been since I was 17. And I come from the East Coast. And as any of you know from Washington, D.C., East Coast, West Coast, very different. So that is yet another identity. I'm in the second half of my life. Thank you for saying I look so young. And I am also part Polish, part Ukrainian, part Irish, and part Italian. So I have a lot of different identities, and I inhabit a lot of different worlds, and all of them are important to me, and some of them are more important, or have been more important at different points in my life than other points in my life. So Tierney's story, my daughter, and my story really are representative personally of what is behind this meaning of intersectionality. It's a very hard word to say. It doesn't roll off the tongue. When I was writing the paper with my colleague Christy Smith, we were trying to come up with a better word for it because in corporate America, people were like, this just doesn't sound good. But there is no other word that really describes the intersection of identities. So what is intersectionality? And you'll see up here there's a picture of an intersection. It was a concept coined, or a term coined, by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. She is a Black legal feminist scholar. And she started doing research into making claims of discrimination as a Black woman. And what she found was that you couldn't make a discrimination claim as a Black woman. You had to do it either as a Black person or as a woman. But for her, there were moments of discrimination in her life and in the lives of the people that she was studying where she was discriminated against as a Black woman, not as a woman or as a person of color. I'd like to share a quote with you from her work where she says, "Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions and sometimes from all of them." So for her, you can experience discrimination running on one track, not necessarily at an intersection, but it's based on one part of your identity. You can experience it from another track based on another part of your identity, but sometimes there's an intersection where you're going to experience discrimination based on those colliding of different identities. So my work with Christy Smith on this topic in corporate America was really to provocatively point out that we're doing something wrong in corporate America. We know when we look at boards, especially of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, it's still older white men, and older white straight men. I think there's only actually one openly gay man that we know of in those ranks. And so we wanted to understand why this is still happening. We've been talking about diversity for seemingly decades now, and nothing really changes. And what our research showed was that when people come into corporations, it is a very diverse slate of individuals, very talented from the best schools. That's not the problem. It's not that the talent's not there, it's that they're not making their way up through the ranks. And so that was what we wanted to try to understand. Why is that? Is there something about the way corporations are dealing with diverse talent that makes them feel too focused on a primary identity or not really understood for the multiplicity of their identities? So obviously corporate America may or may not be interesting to you. We're here today to talk about film. So I did some research on what's going on in the film industry, and some of it is about documentaries and some of it is about the larger film community. And I would argue that they're linked, as in corporate America, where you might have different types of companies, but we all share a similar culture and similar issues. So the first statistic that I've got up here is 1.8% of cinematographers are women. This just came out in an article. That's really sad. And our first parallel with corporate America that I think we can see that some of the stats are not great. Second one is about Oscar voters, and we certainly know about Oscars from this year's news, but 94% of the voters are white, 77% are male, and the average age is 62. So just like corporations, the people making the decisions are still older white men. This, despite the fact that 37 million people watched the Oscars, and I am certain that 94% of them were not white. 4% is the number of women that directed the top movies in the last 13 years. So again, a very sobering fact. And then speaking roles, moving on to actors. You see the large majority of them, there aren't figures here. You don't really need them. The visual tells the story. White followed by much less black, followed by Asian, followed by Latino. What's the critical point here is that we're changing as a nation. By 2043, a majority of the US population will be non-white. And of babies born today, only half of them are white. So there's a real discrepancy between the audiences of films and who's making films and the actual demographics of our country. So what's obviously different in film as opposed to corporations is that films are financed. So I want to really recognize that I get that that's a challenge for you and maybe something different than what we experience in corporations. And when I think about who's doing the financing, I have to admit that flashes go through my mind of people like Brian Grazer, older, stylish, white men holding the purse strings. I don't know if that's the full story, but that is what my perception is when I think about funding of films. So my question to you is, we have numbers to prove that diverse individuals are going to films, so why is there no representation? And can one of the reasons be something about this term, intersectionality? I also want to point out that while these facts are extremely sobering, there are some counterfacts, and there are movies that certainly get made that honor the multiplicity of identities. So movies like Monsters Ball, someone took a chance in that. Movies like Pariah, or the French documentary Entre les Murs, which is one of my favorites about, I see people nodding their heads, about socioeconomics, how they play out in the suburbs of France. So films are getting made, and I wonder whether the people financing films have some sort of confirmation bias that's at play, where they're really funding films that they know work, even though we do have a small slice of films that work that are quite different than that. So again, going back to corporations, I'm going to share a little bit about the history of affirmative action and diversity within corporations, because I think that will help lay the groundwork for some of what you're thinking through and what you're dealing with. So in the 1960s was when we saw the advent of affirmative action. It was obviously when a lot of movements were happening, civil rights marches. That's when corporations and governments started saying, we need to do something about this. We'll take action. We're going to try to get more diverse people, which at that time really meant black people, into government jobs and corporate jobs. In the 1970s, the definition expanded a little bit. More women were going into the workforce, so we started seeing more protections for women, as well as veterans coming back from Vietnam. So we started again seeing a lot of dialogue around those two groups. The 1980s was when formal corporate diversity initiatives started to take place. So these were, again, at that point, really primarily for women and people of color. There was not the expanded definition of diversity that we see today. By the 1990s, we had Americans with Disability Act that shepherded in a whole new era of thinking about diversity in terms of people with disabilities. And then by the 2000s, we started talking about LGBT in the workplace. I would say the T hasn't really been integrated yet, but that is a part of the conversation, and I think we see that playing out live now. So up on the screen, these are depictions of silos. And as you can tell from the way that I described government and corporate thinking about diversity, it is based on a primary identity. So it's based on either race or gender or sexuality or veteran status or disability. There's no intersection between those. And while that made sense at the time and arguably still does, people need safe spaces to talk about issues that impact them, it's creating different problems. So if all of you, I'm sure, have filled out a self-identification form for a job or something at some point, and it forces you to choose a box, and the box is all based in primary identity. And where this becomes complicated is if you're a Korean woman, you would check the box for Korean, for Asian female, but if you're a Japanese woman, you would check the same box. Those cultures are entirely different, and for us to relegate it all to one box is so reductionist and simplistic. By the same token, a Middle Eastern person and a white person would check the same box. But as we know, there's so much discrimination against Middle Eastern people that doesn't touch white people. So for us to have to check the same box isn't fair and isn't accurate. Corporations are doing the same thing. While we also have self-ID forms, we have something else called the Business Resource Group or Employee Resource Group, where people come together based on a primary identity to really talk about issues that are affecting them. So there's at Deloitte, there's a women's group, there's a people of color group, there's a Latino group, there's a gay group. Again, it's all based on primary identity, not any intersection. So we work extremely long hours in corporations. It's lucky to even be able to go to one of these meetings. If you're a black woman like Kimberly Crenshaw, you're gonna probably be forced to choose to either go to the women's meeting or the person of color meeting, and neither one of those may speak to what you're really experiencing as a professional. There's a quote from a playwright, Robert O'Hara. He's a black gay playwright, and he uses the metaphor of vivisection. He doesn't call it that, but of the way that his identity is spliced in the artistic field. So I think it's one that might resonate for you. He says, "Should I walk in the room and leave the gay out of the room or leave the black out of the room? For most of my career, I've had some variation of this question. I think the way to talk about being black and gay is to talk about being whole, being a whole person." And this is really what we're trying to do with this concept of intersectionality. In intersectionality, there are some deeper issues too. So there's the concept of burden versus privilege. So as Robert O'Hara was saying, he sometimes has to choose which primary identity to focus on. So if you're, say, a gay man working in fashion, you may be able to be really open about being gay. But if you're gay in the finance world, that may be something that you cover or mask so that it's not quite as obvious. There are hundreds of examples of this for every race and for every persuasion where people mask certain parts of their identities depending on where they are. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons why corporations are moving away slowly from the term diversity. And I know that this is controversial. I also think that it's helpful. They're moving towards words like inclusion. They want to make sure everybody's included. Diversity has been code, essentially, for people of color, whereas diversity is much more complex than that, and we should honor that diversity by maybe calling it something different. So what Christy Smith and I proposed as an alternative model for thinking about diversity and inclusion initiatives within corporate America is something that's not siloed. It's instead more like a Venn diagram that you see here, where there are overlapping identities. We all have multiple identities, and many of them overlap in ourselves with one another. Whoops. So you've got up here a bunch of different identities. You've got gender, you've got religious affiliation, got vegetarian or non-vegetarian, nationality, higher education, race. So I'd like to just take a moment and everyone, if you have a gender, raise your hand. Okay, I think most people have raised their hand. Keep your hand up if you believe in some sort of higher power. This isn't a trick question. You can put your hand down if you don't. Keep your hand up if you've got a race. Keep your hand up if you have dietary preferences. that may or may not be rooted in culture. Keep your hand up if you've got a nationality. Keep your hand up if you've gone to some sort of higher education. So I think you can't see what I can see, but most people's hands stayed up through all of that. And the purpose of this was really to show that we are all diversity. And while we talk about primary identities, there is far more that is overlapping in our identities that we just don't acknowledge because we're so focused on the primary identity. So you're probably thinking, this sounds slightly controversial, and it is. That was the point of the article. You're probably also thinking, why should I care? We're making films, we're doing our own thing, we're not in a corporate or government structure. Here's why you should care. You see a bunch of young people up on the screen, and they're meant to represent millennials, so anyone born between 1982 and 2000. And they are really your audience or your future audience. And the point is that in 2015, it was 12 to 17-year-olds that went to the movies at a higher percentage than any other demographic. So they're not even millennials, they're the generation after. And what's important about that is while they might not be watching complex documentaries today, they will be at some point. And there have been studies conducted on what millennials and the generation after millennials want to hear and want to think. MTV did a study, and it said what they learned was that millennials do not want to be classified by a single access identity. They don't want that anymore. They don't want checkboxes to check. In Deloitte, we ran a similar culture survey, and we found exactly the same thing. Raven Simonet, who some of you may be familiar with, was a child actress, started on The Cosby Show in the 80s, I think. She is an African American, and she is or was dating a woman. And I don't know, a year or two ago, she said that she does not want to identify as either African American or gay, in spite of those facts about her existence, because she's tired of being labeled. And she got a lot of heat for saying that, and maybe rightfully so. At the same time, she's not alone in that thinking, because that is what we're hearing from people of that generation. So one of the things that Jennifer had mentioned to me before coming here today was that you refer to yourselves as the culture industry. So I wanted to think a little bit about what culture actually means, and I went and looked it up in Webster's dictionary, and it has at least 6 different definitions, all the way from bacterial culture to things about the way that someone can be cultured. The point is that if you're the culture industry, you need to speak to every segment of what culture means to different people. And when I was in Sarah Lawrence and taking a writing class, we did an exercise which is similar to culture, and it may be interesting for you to think about as you're creating films. Everybody was given a piece of paper around the table, and they were asked to define what class meant to them. And every single person had a different response. Some people said it meant they grew up in a trailer park. Others said they went to high school. Others said that it meant they went to college. Such a diversity of thought about one word class, and I think that the word culture is equally complex. So in spite of the near impossibility of defining culture exactly, the point is that as filmmakers, you have a responsibility to really address this multiplicity of what culture means. And you have a responsibility to not recreate these silos that the government and that corporate America have created. You have more freedom to explore things in a way that we can't in such highly, legal or regulatory environments. So again, you might say, okay, these are some facts. Maybe millennials or the generation after will be seeing my films, or maybe they won't, but why should I care? Really, ultimately, I think for some of you, it may be because you're interested in telling the most compelling stories. That's what film is about, whether it's documentary or otherwise. So for you to relate to your audience, you really need to be responding or anticipating the paradigms that are changing in society. When we think of iconic film characters that resonate, I would argue probably most of them are treated in an intersectional manner. So characters like Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver, or something more recent in the Amy Winehouse documentary, that portrait of her was so nuanced and so intersectional. It addressed where she came from in London, her class, her Jewishness, her love of jazz, all of these parts to her that were critical to her identity. So you'll see up here this picture of Felicity Huffman in Transamerica. It was a movie I'm sure you're familiar with from 2005. I was surprised that it was actually so long ago. This is the actual poster, and there's another one where she's facing the bathroom. And what's amazing to me about this is 11 years before this current and frankly annoying debate about which bathrooms people can use. But this film anticipated that this was going to be something to talk about, that it was something worth talking about, and that this person's story and journey was worth honoring through this film. So you as filmmakers can be agents of change in that way. You can create paradigm shifts in culture a decade or more before they actually happen. You're at the front lines of what can change. On the flip side of this, you can also be an agent of regression. So to use the trans example again, thinking about Brian De Palma's Dressed to Kill, I mean, that's the type of movie that can bring trans people back 50 years. I mean, it was essentially a psychopathic Michael Caine in a dress meant to terrify people. And while the film is, fun and campy, it, really did not do anything to help the discussion about trans and trans rights. So I want you to ensure that you're constantly and rigorously searching for these truths when making films, especially when you're dealing with things like subjectivity and objectivity and otherness. In my previous career as an academic, I spent basically a decade thinking about the other and all the things that encompasses. And making documentary films, you're always going to have an other. And so your responsibility to that person or people or subject is to really understand the multiplicity of who that person or those people are. So, my job currently at Deloitte is, as Jennifer said, running strategic, facilitated conversations around the world with clients, many of whom are C-suite executives. And one of the phrases that you all know that we use in most sessions are to call out the elephants in the room. And I'm sure some of you are saying, this all sounds great, but there are still some mechanisms that are preventing us from making quality films. So in particular, women and women of color have more trouble getting financing for films. I just want to call it what it is. I don't have an answer for it, but I want to recognize that it's there. And this is something that I think you will continue to struggle with. I do think linking it back to corporations, again, it's not an issue of talent. Even though we saw that there's a small percentage of women directors directing the most popular films and the low percentage of cinematographers, in film schools, you've got a lot of diversity of talent. So it's really just making sure, again, that talent works their way up through the ranks. Again, I don't know what the answer is to get that funding. Perhaps it has something to do with selling more intersectional stories or pitching things differently. I don't know, and I'll be interested to hear your opinions on that in a few minutes. So before I leave you today, I do want to give you some things to think about that you can take with you, some action items on how you can apply intersectionality to your work. So the first is really to develop your own understanding of multi-identities. So in my opening about my daughter and about myself, I shared more with you than I've shared with anyone really at work. And the importance of doing that is that if you are authentic about all of your overlapping identities, especially with subjects of your film or the objects of your film, they will likely be more receptive to sharing more things with you and potentially not covering or masking things that if they saw your LinkedIn profile, they would think you wouldn't understand. The next is to share those identities as a way of reinforcing that you are a multi-identity, complex, rich, and nuanced person. Dare to have conversations across difference. So I the easy example here is the current state of politics, extremely polarized. I work with people who are not necessarily the same political persuasion as me. We have to work together. We have to understand each other. And really what I find is, because I am forced to not be so aggressive in a corporate environment, that there are many things that link us together. So really daring to talk to people outside of our bubbles so that we can understand where some of those intersections are. Create spaces for you to have these conversations. This is a good place to kick this off today, and I know you're going to have workshops where you can continue this, but these are conversations that you can and should be having repeatedly, challenging yourself and challenging your colleagues to make sure that they're creating films and documentaries that really reflect the multiplicity and the richness of human lives. And challenge yourself to think about who you're pitching your work to. So I made the reference or made the connection that it's difficult to get funding, especially if you're a woman or a woman of color. Think about pitching to other audiences. So I was asked to come here today, not as a filmmaker or anyone who even is adjacent to that industry, but as someone who brings a different perspective. I work in a part of corporate America that is actually quite creative, and we would probably be open to having your perspective or filmmakers or documentaries come into our world and say, this is what we're seeing. So when you're going to the same people, pitching films and hearing no, try pitching elsewhere. And then my favorite one is it's a term coined by legal theorist M.J. Matsuda, and he says to always ask the other question. So if you're talking to somebody about race, and that's what the focus of your documentary is, make sure that you ask the other questions about their gender, questions about their religious affiliation, questions about who they are beyond the primary identity, because the primary identity is the one that you might see. It may not be the one that's most resonant for them, but it's the one that we think that's most resonant for them. So I'm going to end on a little bit of a sobering note. Obviously, the Orlando Massacre happened a couple weeks ago. It was a terrible tragedy. And immediately, much to my disgust but not surprise, politicians started politicizing the event in ways that really reflect for me why intersectionality is so important. So some politicians are saying this should be classified solely as an act of terror. Others are saying it's an act of hate. I don't understand why it can't be both. It was a gay, primarily Latino club. The shooter was a radical Muslim, also seemingly in the closet now. A lot of intersecting identities were at play here, and for people to try to reduce this to it's either an act of terror or an act of hate, there's a lot more at play here. And this is where I think you come in. I'm sure there are going to be films made about these victims, potentially about the shooter, and to really dig deep into what those identities are and not only focus on the primary identity. The one thing that is a real benefit for you, as I mentioned before, is you're not going to be forced to stick to regulatory rules about how you discuss things like race and gender and religion. You can be much more provocative than I ever could be. And so that is my call to action for you, to continue being provocative and making sure that you ask those other questions and honor the subjects of your films in a way that really represents the whole complex, rich life of that individual. Yes, securing funding might be tough, but I think to some of the groundbreaking documentaries that were really important to me and are truly intersectional, so movies like Tongues Untied or Paris is Burning, I don't know how they got funding for those movies, but they are very nuanced portraits of intersectional characters and lives. So it can be done, it may be hard, and I hope that you can take some of these thoughts with you as you continue to make films, make good films, and get funding for them. So thank you. So we have some time for Q&A.
We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I know people are chomping at the bit to ask questions, but we have been webcasting, and there are a couple of questions that have come in online. So I'm going to ask one.
Okay.
How would you describe intersectionality to student filmmakers or students in general?
I don't think I would describe it much differently than I did now. There is an example that I didn't give, and maybe if I was describing it to students, I would say it. But take the phrase, an unmarried Asian woman over 40. You've got a lot of descriptors in there. And if you take any of them out, the picture that you envision of that person may be very different. So if you say an Asian woman, something will come to mind. If you say an unmarried Asian woman, something else might come to mind. If you say an unmarried Asian woman over 40, other things might come to mind. So that is how I would describe how you can think about intersectionality. And it's really just remembering that there are all of these identities, race, gender, marital status, sexuality, that can overlap in interesting ways.
Questions from the audience?
How do you account for the sort of measurements that we've found necessary so far to get to more representation at the table? That's where I think I fall off with intersectionality.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you, and I think this is the real paradox of intersectionality. I mean, you still want to be counting people because that's how we know who we have. Why intersectionality is important, in addition to the counting, is that we know from decades of trying to make more diverse talent rise the ranks and failing at it, that we need to bring those older white men into the conversation. And so to make an argument about intersectionality that they too are diverse, that's the point of what I was talking about for my background, you know? I mean, if you can explain to them that they have probably been left out at some point in their life, they have probably been marginalized, likely not in the same ways as people who've been discriminated against. But if you can make them feel even slightly what that is like to be marginalized, that's how you're going to get more of their support. I truly believe that. You don't.
Well, I think that there's a distinction between something that is structural and something that is personal. And I think what you're talking about in terms of some common base of understanding, that's a good tactic. I get that. But when you're talking about trying to develop processes that can lead to change, which is what you're talking about when you're talking about institutions, I don't know that I buy that. Because that, there's a difference in terms of experience. And for the privileged straight white male, they've not experienced the same kind of exclusions or barriers that someone who is not there. And it's what in the court system it's called, referred to as immutable characteristics. One can't change the color of their skin, national origin or the like, which is what can be the object of the barrier. So I think that accountability in terms of process to get change requires that kind of checking of the box. I'm not comfortable with it. I mean, I can see why people aren't comfortable with it. And I'm old, I've been around, I know why this developed and why it continues to exist. But so far as I know, it's the most effective mechanism that we have. What you're talking about is a strategy or a tactic.
Yeah, and I agree. And I'm not saying that we should stop measuring. What I do think the government should do, and probably won't, is to make more checkboxes. So, to not force a Middle Eastern person and a white person who grew up in America to check the same box, because then you're getting false measurements. You're not truly measuring who has access to things. I think it works for some groups more than others.
What are your thoughts on the paradox between the diversity of creative content consumers and the lack of diversity in the content creators sometimes, and certainly those that are the gatekeepers, that are the financiers and decide what's made and programmed? And then some of the films you identified, like Paris is Burning and the other ones, because they may seem like they're genre films, because of the intersectionality of it, there's a universality that more mainstream audiences are able to connect to because of that. And I just wanted to know some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that you've hit on something important, and the thing with intersectionality is that there can be a universal appeal to those stories. Tongues Untied, I don't know if any of you have seen it, that I don't think is all that mainstream, and I don't think that's quite universal, and that still was successful. So I do think that some films can get made that are quite edgy, not mainstream, not necessarily universal, but still can be very successful. There is a paradox. I mean, Jennifer and I were talking before this about PBS and how, the PBS audiences can be maybe wealthier, funding things like Downton Abbey, very white show, maybe, the whitest type of programming. But then there was also the Black Panthers documentary, which was quite popular. And I think, thank goodness for artists like Beyonce who are starting to push the envelope and making us think through a little bit harder things that should be more palatable for the general public.
How can we take intersectionality out into the world and get it back to where it was when Marlon's got his film funded? It's gone so far back since then.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I do think, the documentary that I mentioned, Amy, which I'm sure many of you have seen, that was a huge success. And while that was not nearly as controversial or about a marginal community like Tongues Untied was, I think that there is an audience for this. And in terms of funding, I would challenge you to think of who are you going to for funding. Think, a little bit in terms of the different types of groups that you can go to. You can think of corporate America as a way of getting funding. Corporate America has quite a bit of money. And while they may be risk averse, they may also want to be at the forefront of some of these conversations. Deloitte was really happy to have me and Christy work on intersectionality, and be at kind of the forefront of that piece of new way of thinking about diversity in corporate America. Intersectionality has been around for decades, and it is slightly controversial to potentially water it down by bringing it into other spheres. I know some people think that. I think the opposite. I think the more that we can disseminate the concept into different spheres of people who otherwise wouldn't have access to the content, all the more power we will have.